Pleasure, because Jim really has been at the forefront of research and academic inquiries into a number of important issues in relation to Islam, Islamic studies, and in particular what is known as the Muslim Ummah, the global Muslim community. Of course, there's a lot of stuff said about the Muslim Ummah. There's in many cases some really quite unhelpful commentary going about in relation to the characteristics, the manifestations, what it reflects in present-day Muslim societies. But let's remember that the Muslim Ummah in particular really reflects two things. One is the search for a global kind of a solidarity among Muslims, something that Islam has always preached through its very message. But that message of global solidarity, which in many cases we can look at in cosmopolitan terms, as your paper will be touching upon, Jim, also clashes in many cases with the reality of present-day nation states across the Middle East. So we've got also that territorialized, if you like, form of belonging for Muslims, which again can manifest also in many cases among Muslim diaspora in particular, in ugly communitarianism in some cases. So to be able to make sense of communitarianism, nation-state politics, and the global cosmopolitan tendency within the Muslim Ummah is now mean feast. And I think if you've read some of Jim's work, you'll see that he's done an absolutely wonderful job in trying to reconcile some of those tensions, drawing on historical analysis and drawing on some contemporary manifestations, in particular in light of what's happened since 9/11. That's really what I think James will be trying to really engage with in his talk. And I know this is part of a book that he's working on, In Search of the Ummah, I think, the title. Yeah. But for those who don't know James, and you can go and look at his unbelievably impressive CV, he's had so many unbelievable jobs. Here at ANU was professor and deputy director of the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies. Before that, at Oxford, I think, research fellow. Most recently, Durham, head of school. So you gave up? You gave the head of school job?
Yes, I was. Yeah, I've given up. Yes.
Good thing. God. And now we're very lucky that he's come back to the ANU as a visiting professor for 2016. And as I said earlier, it is an absolute pleasure for us to be hosting Professor Piscatori. So please join me formally to welcome him to Deakin and to the Alfred Deakin Institute in particular. So welcome, James. I was telling Jim earlier that he will speak for about 40-45 minutes, then hopefully we'll have about half an hour for discussion. So over to you, Jim.
Okay, thanks. Thanks ever so much, Fethi, and thank you all for coming. This feels like my second home. I feel very comfortable visiting here. I know so many here. Fethi, of course, is such a great friend. Shahram, we go back, way back. It's so wonderful to see you again, and Greg and Ben and the rest of you. So thank you very much for coming. I'm always enjoying my visits to Melbourne, but especially to Deakin and to this institute. And congratulations on the development of the institute and your new beautiful surroundings. It's fantastic. As Fethi said, what I'd like to talk about is the Ummah, or the community of the faith, the pan-Islamic community. Let me just give a little bit of biography in the sense that it's a subject which has long been of concern to mine. Way back when, about 100 years ago, when I was much younger, I did a work on nationalism, and very unwisely said in the first sentence of the foreword that this was on the one hand, and on the other hand was to come in a second volume. Well, 30 years later, I am now inching towards the second volume, which is meant to be what about the transnational side? What about sides which is not in terms of nationalism or particularized identities? And so that's what I have been working on. What I'd like to do is to try to give you the lay of the land, as it were, the sort of larger geography of the subject. And as you know instinctively, one of the hidden agendas of the argument is that most people don't think there is an Ummah, or most non-Muslims don't think that there is an Ummah. And if you do think that there's an Umma, you probably think it's hostile and aggressive. So it's really that kind of dilemma of how does one view it that I want to look at. And what I will be trying to do is to combine what I would call the normative and the sociological, or in effect sort of the ideas with some of the empirical patterns. So lest you fall asleep, I thought I would give you the conclusion now, and so you can relax. Essentially, what I want to conclude is that everyone uses the concept of the Umma, but in fact it means very many different things to everyone. You know, you constantly hear the term invoked. But in fact, it's very, very difficult to pin it down, very difficult to get a clear definition of it, a clear understanding of it. So what I'd like to suggest is that there is a tension here between the communitarian and the cosmopolitan. It is a communitarian idea, quite clearly, in the sense that the individual is the individual's morality, the individual's persona, makeup, social standing, etc., is in part, in large part, affected by the community, by membership in a larger community of the faith. So there is sort of solidarity, but they're relatively unclear where the boundaries lie. I also like to suggest that it's a cosmopolitan idea, and I think this is probably not the version that I wanted to use. But is there another one? I think this was my first attempt. No, go on to PowerPoints, please. PowerPoint. Yeah, that was way early. And this one.
There you go.
There we go. Okay, so it's more or less the same, but but I did change the kind of order of it. Okay, so it is a sense communitarian in the sense of belonging to a larger community. Cosmopolitan, okay, two senses of cosmopolitan. Is it universal in that sense of cosmopolitanism, and is it tolerant? Is it tolerant of diversity, tolerant of pluralism? And that's the kind of tension in the debate that I want to talk about. And it does seem to me that there's a certain paradox here, that as the Ummah is gaining sort of social weight, as the imaginary is becoming more concrete in a way, sort of a social construct, largely due to changes in thinking, largely due to transnational exchanges, it is also being reified along internal boundary lines. This, of course, is going to be sectarianism and the differences among Muslims themselves. So I'm going to argue that it is cosmopolitan and that it is to a certain extent communitarian, but that there are certainly problems and tensions within. I think I just do this, yes? Okay, so first of all I want to say ambiguity of terms, ambiguity of thought. If one were to look at the textual references, there would be something over 49 references to the Ummah. Of course, the most famous of these references are that that there is one community of the faith, the Ummah Wahida, but also that it is the best community among the people. There are other references, of course, Quranic references. There are many, many, if one looks at the tafsirs or the exegetical commentaries on the Quran, one will find very different interpretations of what the special community means, the best community means, etc. So all of that is subject to a certain amount of debate. Lane, you will know, is the great historical sort of etymological source for most of us looking at Arabic. If you look at Lane, Lane said that Ummah comes from track, path, or way. Okay, this is its core meaning. But there's also a kind of sociological sort of ambiguity here. Are we talking about an association? Are we talking about society? Are we talking about a community? So putting it more simply, how tight is this organization? How tight is this group? How cohesive is it? So it's most often thought of as having interconnectedness. Sorry, apologies, my back. But I need to keep looking at this. The interconnectedness plus a certain amount of identity. So most people would translate that as a community. So here's the core question for us, and I'll now go on to give you 3 more questions. But the core question in a way is the Umma a community of fellow travelers, or is it a community of destiny? And I think that's an interesting way to think about it, because there is that sort of tension. And one could make an argument in many ways both ways. Okay, what would be the kind of received wisdom, the received understanding? The conventional view would be that there shouldn't be any kinds of borders within the Islamic world, that there is a community of the faith and it should be seamless, that there should be not any kind of recognized or constructed, structured divisions within this community of the faith. All Muslims constitute a Ummah Wahida. So we can say that roughly in the medieval period, roughly from 1100 to 1500, that was more or less true. More or less true. I mean, political boundaries weren't as important as they were later. But very soon after this medieval marking point, we have the 3 great empires, the Ottoman, the Safavid, the Mughal, who in a way not only create different imperial centers, so we certainly don't have one center of the Ummah, we have multiple centers now, but in addition to that we have the whole structuration around empire, around an imperial order. And so over time, that of course crystallizes into dynastic and territorial rivalries. The graphics is simply to remind us that of course that in the medieval period, someone like Ibn Battuta would have traveled across this grand expanse thinking that he was in the same cultural zone. And so that's important. And of course, ziyarah, of the Hajj pilgrimage, and many other examples of movement today, I'll talk about that in a moment, are still persistent, are still very much defining part of Muslim identity. So I did mention this concretization of dynastic and territorial rivalries. Of course, we get to the modern period, and there's absolutely no question. And in fact, most people would say, where's the Ummah? There is no Ummah. They're just simply territorial states. And of course, the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I mean, Sharon will know we just had the Iranian foreign minister the other day, and he gave a wonderful, beautiful speech about how we must break through the paradigm of international relations. We must not think in zero-sum games. We must think in terms of dialogue. We must recognize the unity of the Islamic world. And then in the questions, the Saudis are the enemy. And these damn Arabs. And so it all broke down, of course, when we got to the specifics. And it was a reaffirmation of the territorial national divisions of the Ummah. And of course, we have all these fragmentations, the governments, sub-state actors will talk about that, different intellectuals, think tanks. Who speaks for Islam? Everybody does. And there's a certain plausibility to the fragmentation. And so we have a complication of the situation. So what I would say is it's a complex geography, a complex political geography. And yet, Muslims will say, universally, Muslims will say, but it has a palpable presence. It means something to me. And let's just take a negative example. The man who rushed into the restaurant in Paris, C'est pour la Syrie. This is for Syria. The man who killed Rigby on the streets of London said, this is for Iraq. This is because British soldiers are killing my brothers in Iraq. So there is this kind of palpable presence that is here, a sort of sense that it is important. So 3 questions, and I think that the questions have been intensified after the abolition of the caliphate. Admittedly, this is a kind of heavy Sunni sort of approach, but I can talk about the Shia side of it as well. as you probably know, the caliphate was abolished in March of 1924. And from that point, we have all kinds of problems that emerge. So 3 questions to me seem to be critical to this. How did the modern idea of the pan-Islamic community develop? Okay? Because I don't want to deny that there wasn't beforehand a sense of the Ummah, or it wasn't talked about before, but there's something really different about the modern period. Secondly, who belongs to the community, to the Ummah? Fatih used the term belonging, and that's key to all of this. Who belongs to this community? And then finally, how much difference is allowed? What are the parameters of permissible difference within the Ummah? So these are kind of theoretical questions, philosophical questions, but I think that they are relevant to many of the practical matters that we deal with. So for the first question, how did the pan-Islamic idea develop? I'm just going to zip through this fairly quickly because it's kind of intellectual but also political history. But there's kind of a point to it. The point is not just my 5 factors that I'm now going to give you. It's to show that there, in a way, these kind of ways of looking at it, these kinds of avenues towards the discussion, towards the concept, are more or less still around. So the first, we can say that we can go back and look at the popular expression through the media, the sense that there might have been a feeling that people belonged. And where did most of this stuff come from? It came from what would be called the periphery. It came from South Asia, not the heartland, the Arab world. And what was reputed to be the heartland. And so, we have Abdul Kalam Azad's Al-Hilal, a newspaper, which was important here, and other newspapers, where they began to express the idea that we belong. And this is before the abolition of the caliphate. Self-interested promoters, there's just an example. You know about the last Sultan Abdul Hamid, who espoused an explicit policy of pan-Islamism. Why? To save his throne, to save the Ottoman Empire. And then we have, we'll come back to the Orientalists, but we have Blunt, a British writer who was pushing it, but more or less because he was pushing himself in all of this. So we have self-interested promoters. And as I say, this stuff relates to the 1920s, 1930s, but you can find them all today. There are all kinds of self-promoting Ummah specialists today. The Muslim Congresses, again, there's a reference to it. There were a whole number of them that occurred immediately after. They were obsessed with the key question, what do we do now that the caliphate is gone? 1924, 1926, 1931, no agreement. Why? Everybody wanted to be the caliph. And no one could agree on who should it be. And so there was an obviously built-in problem. But we can say maybe 2 things emerged from it. One is that Palestine now becomes the arch symbol of the Ummah. But we all have something we can agree on. And what we can agree on is that, wow, we're losing Palestine. The Zionist program is increasing. We ought to do something. And I'm telling you, it's an Islamic issue because of Jerusalem. And so that kind of attitude was developed greatly as a reason, particularly in 1931 by the Mufti of Jerusalem. But also the stirrings of transnational networks. I wish I had brought it, but there's a quote from one of the great, you'd know who he is, George Antonius, who was a British official who wrote a great book on Arab nationalism. He sent a telegram back to London and he said, for the first time, His Majesty's government is viewing a uniting, if not already, a united Islam. I mean, clear overstatement. But he was at these congresses and he thought, something's happening. These people are coming together and they're starting to think. Muslim thought, I'm just going to zip through it, but this is about the caliphate itself. You know, of course, the classic restatement of it is Rashid Ridda, al-Khilafa wal-Imama al-Uzma, you know, restore the caliphate. Then we have Abdul Razik, radical separation. It's a temporal institution, it can't be rebuilt. And then we have Sonhori, who basically said, create a kind of UN, a kind of Muslim League of Nations. The territorial states are not going to go away, so let's just put them together in a kind of a Muslim international order. So those kind of debates are still going on, by the way. There's a Sheikh Ghazali, not the medieval Sheikh Ghazali, but an Egyptian Sheikh Ghazali now, who actually just repeated all this stuff about the League of Muslim Nations. That's what we want. We want, look, Egypt's not going to go away, but what we wanted is to be part of a Muslim interstate system. So Muslim thought is confused, or at least in several schools of thought, and it's all out there to play for. And then finally, the Orientalists, and I'm gonna tempt fate here and say a nice word about the Orientalists. and the Orientalists admired this idea of the Ummah. They thought it was great. They did say that the caliphate was a temporal institution and therefore replaceable. But if the caliphate can't be reproduced, then what do we have? We have the spiritual unity of the Muslim people. And Gibb called it the psychological unity and universalism of the Muslim people. And he meant it as an admiring thing. These guys have principles. We don't. And so the Orientalists contributed to all this, and Muslim thought, to some extent, in the journals, the intellectual journals, begins to reflect this. And we'll sort of say, well, if they think we're great, if they think the Ummah is a good idea, then maybe it is a good idea. So we have that. Okay, more recently, obviously the growth of transnational Islam, and this I'm sure you've had a lot from Fethi and Sharam and Greg, and all these ideas about pilgrimages. I talked about the Hajj, the ziyarah to the pilgrimage to shrine centers, etc. Migration, exchange of ideas, student groups, civil society groups, etc. And of course, internet, the communication technologies have been key to all of this idea in the sense of reinforcing the sense, partly, and this is what your institute does, not just globalization, but that there should be a borderless Islam, that we're somehow all connected in all of this. So I put that in. And I think the role of Muslim minorities is critical to this. Why? Because we have a doctrinal expectation. The doctrinal expectation is that if you migrate away from the Muslim lands for necessity purposes, you must return to Islamic lands. However, it is clearly, and this is of course what the present caliph is saying, he called very specifically, it's the concept of hijrah, and he very specifically called on people to do hijrah to the Islamic lands of Raqqa and places like that. So that's the doctrinal expectation. Well, the doctrinal expectation has been subverted by the permanent migration to the West, to other places, and so clearly the Muslim minorities who aren't out there, who are here, have to be part of the Ummah because they're members of the faith. So that's, and I like, Clifford Geertz had a really nice phrase. He talked about the progressive disentanglement of religions from the places where they were rooted, from the places where they were born. So that is what's important, this disentanglement. And so you go off to Australia, you go off to Canada, and you will have, you're not going to go back, so are you therefore part of the Ummah? Unquestionably, yes. However, a complicated yes. Because jurists are now beginning to recognize that there are special circumstances about the minority situation. And so there is a jurisprudence of the minorities that is being articulated. And of course, the standard one is what about if you live in a society where you need a mortgage? Can mortgages be approved of in an Islamic sense? So we have all kinds of legal interpretations here. the most controversial, and many of you know who Yusuf al-Qaradawi is, you know, one of my former students wrote an article for Yale in which he called him the virtual caliph because he's so prominent on Jazeera, etc. Qaradawi very famously gave a fatwa at the time of Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, in which the coalition was sent. Remember, the coalition not only had Muslim soldiers in Western armies, but of course there were Muslim soldiers in the Muslim countries, the Arab countries that fought against Saddam. So you have, theoretically now and practically, you have Muslim soldier killing Muslim soldier. Is this permissible? And the question was specifically asked by the chaplain of the United States Army. So it was the question of the minority situation, and that's all he answered. And he answered that it was permissible for American Muslim soldiers to kill Muslims in the Middle East. Why? Because the situation of the minority was a peculiar situation, and they had to certify that they were loyal citizens of darura, you know, necessity. Out of necessity, they have to obey. So there is a certain complication to the minorities thing, but quite clearly this plays into the idea that they are very much part of the Ummah. And finally, and I get into trouble everywhere, of course, in the Muslim world, there is an Ummah industry. And there is a deliberate top-down approach to create the Ummah. And you know, we know this is very largely state-driven. You know, pick a state, and they will do it. And of course, you know, just the top ones, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, Malaysia. I mean, the Malaysians are probably the most intense of everybody, believe it or not. And, you know, all kinds of institutions, all kinds of journals. I mean, there must be hundreds of conferences on this subject, all promoted by the Malaysians or somebody, to say, you know, we belong to the Ummah. What are the implications of belonging to the Ummah? I mentioned the OIC, and actually it's more complicated. I just did it because I like their symbol. And I just wanted you to see their symbol. So, you know, combining the crescent with the globe and the Kaaba, so it's quite nice. Like any interstate organization, it is intended to preserve the sovereignty of its members. So it's not what you would call an Ummah building institution. However, it does say in its constitution that it wishes to promote Islamic unity, and it does have the Islamic Solidarity Fund and cultural events, etc., which say it's there. So it actually is an interstate organization. But the Muslim World League is more committed to this idea. This is a Saudi-backed institution. And, you know, I mean, there better be a reward in the next life, because I've actually read these journals. and they, you know, I mean, I would not highly recommend them to you. They're incredibly dense comments about how we're all belonging to, you know, it's constant repetition. We belong together, we're all part of one sort of thing, etc. So this is the Saudi one, this is the Malaysian one, and Risalat al-Taqrib is an Iranian one. And I'll come back to this point about what Taqrib is, and it's basically a reconciliation of the different schools of thought, legal schools of thought. So bringing them together. And so the Saudis are, the Iranians were saying at this point, which again isn't interesting, you know, the great Shiite revolution actually promotes this idea where they're saying, we're not really promoting Shiism, we're promoting the bringing together. I'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so the answer to the first question, how did this pan-Islamic community develop? Well, I think it developed normatively and sociologically. What I'm trying to suggest is that through the intellectual and political debates, this idea of a pan-Islamic connectedness has now got a self-consciousness to it. Putting it pretentiously, it is objectified. Okay? And it is something which might have been innate. It might have been part of your makeup. we just had 2 workshops, one in Durham and one in KL, of a group of, so we had a nice young British Muslim guy from Pakistani background called Fayez. And we would go, we'd go through all these journals and everything, and he would say, and it became the mantra of our workshops, but what about my mother? What about my uneducated mother who can't speak English, who is living in the UK but is not integrated, who is not highly educated, who's not thinking in terms of doctrine, but really cares about her brothers and sisters in the Muslim world? What about my mother? And I think that that sense of, that instinctive sense, there's something there, has always been there, but it becomes much more apparent, much more manifest, much more explicit through this process that I've been talking about. Okay? And in fact, Muslim writings today will reflect that. The rhetorical trope is the family. We are a brotherhood. We are all children of the Ummah. Sometimes we're all grandchildren of the Ummah. And sometimes to indicate dismay, to indicate distress at the lack of unity, they will say, we are orphans of the Ummah. It's really powerful stuff. It's repeated repeatedly, repeated constantly, and so you see that. So it is a kind of imagining. And we must make our obligatory reference to Benedict Anderson. I'm not going to take you down this cliched path, just simply to remind you that he was right in the sense that it is not just a projection of an idea, but that it has to be based on something. And the transnational, as print capitalism was important for the development of nationalism, the transnational media is important for the development of the Ummah idea. So what do we get? We get an instructive moral voice. We get the idea that it's an element of the faith. This may sound like I'm saying nothing, but actually it's an important point. You're consciously saying the Ummah is an element of the faith. Not just that it's there. Not just that there is one God and there is his prophet Muhammad, but now that the Ummah is core idea, it's a core principle. And so therefore I think it's communitarian. So, some might call this a peoplehood, and there are political scientists, political sociologists who are trying to articulate this idea of peoplehood, that there's a better way of saying it. I think you can use communitarian. I think it follows the Etzioni approach. Why? Because it does 2 things. There are webs of effective cross-cutting relationships, all this transnational development and movement, and a commitment to a common culture. Okay, now the common culture, we'll have to complexify it, if that's a word, in a moment. But there's something there. Okay, so that's why it's communitarian. And it's also worldwide. It's also worldwide. Muslims are everywhere. And everywhere where Muslims are, there is the Ummah. Australia, Somalia, Baghdad. Everywhere. But it's not tightly communitarian. Okay, because we have associational effective affiliation, but we do have differentiation, we do have normative variation. More about that in a minute. So I would say, yes, it's communitarian. Now the next question is it cosmopolitan? And the 2 senses of the cosmopolitan follow my 2 other questions. Universal, who belongs to the Ummah? Tolerant, how much difference is allowed within the Ummah? Okay, so I hope I got my point across about the construction of the pan-Islamic community. Now I want to talk about this side of it. So who belongs to it? So it's the question of cosmopolitan universalism. The Ummah Islamiyya is of course understood to include Muslims, of course. But should it include non-Muslims? Okay. a sort of a theological debate about Abraham, Ibrahim. Okay, so the Quran says, actually, I highly recommend you, if you don't know it, go and look at the Quranic references to Abraham. It's really interesting. By the way, the Quran says that Abraham was an Umma, and that has puzzled exegetes for centuries. What does that mean? Ibrahim is an Umma. Okay, so what I want to get across is that the Quran says he was neither a Christian nor a Jew. Okay? But in fact, he was an upright Muslim. Hanifan Musliman. But this is a kind of, if you will, in the kind of translated sense, small m Muslim rather than capital M. What it meant is that he was the believer in the one God. This is what it meant, that he was the arch monotheist. And many liberals will take, Talal Assad and others, will take from this that therefore anyone who submits to the one God is a believer. And the Ummah is the community of believers. So it kind of strips away the doctrinal hardness of it. You must belong to this school of thought. You must have this sheikh. You must have gone to this madrasa. Forget all that. Do you believe in the one God? And if you believe in the one God, you're a member of the Ummah. So in that sense, there is a kind of an inclusive, encompassing sense of the Ummah. But of course, it's not the only one. There are others who now become its harder interpretation, the juridical interpretation. There's the realm of Islam, there's the realm of non-Islam, using the word for war for non-Islam, harb. There's a distinction between the Muslims and the kuffar, who, and as you know, this is the whole point of ISIS now, is to indicate who are the unbelievers, who are the kuffar, etc. There's even a debate, these are theological debates, but they have practical debates. There's even a debate about who are the friends, the awliya. Who are the friends of God? And can you be friends? Salafis, and of course ISIS, etc., but many Salafi groups, non-violent Salafi groups, go to a mosque in Bradford, go to a mosque in the north of England, and you will find Salafi tracts which says, you cannot be friends with non-Muslims. This is unacceptable. And so this whole debate is a harsh one, but it's there. So against the cosmopolitan ideal, we have some particularisms. The distinction between the Muslim and the non-Muslim is emphasized. The strangeness of strangers is what is emphasized. The strangeness of strangers. But ironically, for some, it can also be universalistic because we're going to take over. So we have this complicated situation. On the one hand, we have an encompassing idea that a liberal interpretation of the Ummah would be anybody who believes in the one God. Why are we hung up with all these doctrinal distinctions? Just get back to basics. These guys would say, but the basics are everything. These kind of textualized, rather externalized ways of looking at things are there. And at the end of the day, they are strange. At the end of the day, they are the other. They're not us. And so there's a kind of division here. So we also have to add to that these empirical. The fact that there are other identities being globalized. Apatorai, an anthropologist, makes a good point about the primordia, ethnicities, etc. That those things are going on too. That would take you away from a kind of universalist view. Social media communications can unite, and we well know it can fragment us. It can create atomization rather than a kind of a community, a unity. And of course the growth of radical sub-state actors who would say, what is this kind of weak sense of the Ummah? So, just as an example, to remind you of two of the on the hit list from the UK. We had, and that I mean in a kind of double sense, and both sort of popular in some circles and also targeted by the security services. So we have a kind of an exclusivism. So Umma Bakri Muhammad, the green flag of Islam will fly soon over 10 Downing Street. That sort of argument. Abu Hamza, these guys, of course, are in prison now, and they've been tracked by the security services for a long time. But for a long time, they have been saying, so we are here in the UK, but why don't we do hijrah away from the UK to an Islamic land? Because it doesn't make a difference, just wait. It's about to become Muslim. The Queen will be Muslim at 10 Downing Street, etc. So, it's there's a kind of certitude built into it. Okay, so the answer to the second question, who's in this Ummah? All Muslims, all monotheists, all mankind. Take your pick. Most would say that it's far-reaching in scope. Most would say, of course, Muslims. All would say Muslims. Some liberal elements would say it involves the Abrahamic religions. So that's good. Conservatives will say, this is kind of like the Saudi approach, Saudi Dawah approach. Conversion will occur. So, throw enough money at everybody and etc. Conversion will occur. So you're not yet, the world is not yet Muslim, but it will be. But then, of course, there's the minority who take it even a step further, who say it's a hostile universalism. ISIS, you will be forced to be Muslim. And so we have a kind of a mixture here. So now we go to the third question. How much difference is allowed? And I'm doing okay? Yeah. Another 20 minutes maybe? How much difference is allowed? Okay, so this is a question of tolerance. So on the one hand, we have to think about the classic situation of Islam. The classic situation of Islam does allow for difference. Many of you will know this is ikhtilaf. Okay? So it's how much difference is permissible. Islam basically has a nice system. It basically says difference is allowed, but within certain parameters. Within certain parameters. So it's not a free-for-all. It's a guided allowance of difference, and that's that. So you can, as long as it sticks within the valid theological consensus, you can have difference, and that's an important principle behind the development of Islam. But of course, sectarianism, and this of course is, I don't need to develop this. We're living it every day. So this goes on. Go back to the 12th, we think it's not, of course, it's not just modern. Ibn al-Jawzi in the 12th century wrote, Talbis Iblis, the devil's deception, in which he really meant the Sufis and the Shia. They're beyond the pale. And of course, it's what ISIS says today. And so we have these kinds of diatribes against the Wahhabi ISIS attacks on the Shia. So you wonder, we are all brothers except those Shia, who cannot be a brother of mine. You can see instantly the contradiction built into the logic here. And then many times we can say that the distinctive feature of the modern landscape is accentuation of difference. I am a Shia, I am Sunni, I am a Wahhabi, I am a Salafi, rather than saying I am Muslim. And at times this accentuation of difference can seem so strong that any sense of the Ummah seems to disappear into the ether. Where is it? And so it's a powerful, powerful sort of thing. The attack on the Shia, the little boy wounded in Iraq who's holding on to the Imam Hussein as a kind of healing device. So you can see the sectarian divisions are strong. But there have been attempts to bridge it, and these are examples. Persia in the 19th century. Many of you will know that the famous fatwa from Al-Azhar in the Nasserist period saying that the Shia were a valid school of law. So there were attempts. The Iranians, of course, this taqrib idea that there should be a reconciliation of legal schools. The most recent has been the Amman message that King Abdullah of Jordan called a big conference in Jordan where he said, the purpose of this meeting is, quote unquote, to unify the Islamic Ummah. And they had two conclusions from this. One, no Muslim can pronounce another Muslim as non-Muslim. In other words, takfir haram, stated in simple terms, that clearly. And secondly, there are 8 valid schools of interpretation. 8. And they named them. And these are all Islam. This is not, and anybody professing these eight theological paths is a Muslim. So it was a very, very clear attempt to stop all of this craziness that flows from the kind of the sectarianization and fragmentation of Islam. So the answer to the third question, how much difference is allowable within the Ummah? Well, some within carefully prescribed limits, but not too much. Not too much difference. And we know that the historical record has diverged from what the classic idea should be. And it's probably the same as all unity and diversity projects, right? There are lots of unity and diversity projects that we can think of. You know, there must be unity, but there's a fact of diversity. So it's similar to that, but it's particularly awkward, maybe even particularly embarrassing for the promoters of the Ummah that this is occurring in a theology which says the default position is brotherhood. If the default position is brotherhood, where is it? And when it comes to fellow Muslims. And so that debate goes on. So I'm going to end on this. I want to summarize it by saying that I think there are 4 tensions that control this discussion. There are here. The first is authenticity, hybridity. Okay? Everybody's looking for what is authentically Islamic. And what I've been trying to argue is that people are saying that the Ummah is part of authentic Islam. But what is authentic? What is authenticity? Because there's the obvious reality of hybridity, the obvious reality of difference. There are just so many differences. So we have the pull of authenticity, but the reality, the drag of hybridity. And we have to work out those tensions. The second one is the tension between implicit and explicit. Okay? Implicit. This is Fayez's mother. Common sense of connectedness, visiting graves, concern for Muslims elsewhere, the feeling that if you do good, you are fulfilling an Islamic duty. One of the participants in our workshop said, "We are brothers who are not yet brothers." It's very, very. Wasn't this group good? I got to steal all their words and publish them. Brothers who are not yet brothers. It's good. It's a nice phrase. We know we're connected. We know it means something, but that brotherhood is still elusive at the end of the day. So we have something about the implicitness to it. The explicit side of it is partly, again, we go back to Geertz. Geertz said something important is happening here, that religion is taking on a public persona. But it's not just that religion has a public thing, it's that you publicly believe that your public identity is defined in part by religion. He says it's a negotiable, it's a mobile instrument of public identity. So there's part of that. This kind of, I'm a Sunni, and I'm going to stop those damn Shia. You know, that's an example of what Geertz was talking about, this explicitness to it. And another part of this is this top-down manipulation, my Umma industry. The fact that people are actually saying, this is what we do, this is where we belong, we must do this. And you remember I mentioned Abdul Hamid at the end of the Ottoman Empire. So Pan-Islamism was just an earlier version of this. The idea that there's an explicit ideology which is explicitly telling you that you belong to this. So there's a tension, implicit, explicit. Third tension is detachment, attachment. Okay? So this has got a lot to do with the debates in transnational theory, right? Transnationalism is, you know, simplifying it grossly. First iteration of transnational theory, the state was going to disappear, transnationalism would be more important. We know that that's not true. We know that there's a combination of them. They coexist. So yes, to a certain extent, there are broader cultural geographies. And there is a certain detachment from the nation state. And maybe a summary of this is the state system is not displaced by the Ummah, but can be affected by it. Okay, so that's sort of a difference. But there's also attachment. And the attachment is these localized kinships. So yeah, you're kind of detached from the nation state to some extent, not entirely, but there's also things like ethnicity. There's also things like these other ideas. And I just, some of you may be interested in these people I cite here, but because they're quite interesting. You probably don't know who Penina Verbner is. She's an anthropologist in the UK, and she has written on the development of Sufism in the UK. And she does it in the context of global Sufism, and you know, really fascinating stuff. That Pakistani Muslims in the UK used to go to Pakistan to do pilgrimage to the saint shrines. Now, Pakistani Muslims from Pakistan come to the UK to do ziyarah in the UK because there are Sufi shrines in the UK. So we have the opposite way of moving. And she argues that there's a global Sufism. This shows there's a global logic of Sufism, but it's valorized through concrete embodiments. So you have something broad, but you also have something, it takes meaning insofar as it's rooted. And so there's that part of it. And then finally, the communitarian cosmopolitan tension. Okay? So communitarian, yes, in the sense of self-awareness, that the individual is fulfilled, that you belong to a part of a larger enterprise, that the community self-consciously, you understand, provides a moral voice for you. That's communitarian. But it's not a tight communitarianism. It's not tightly cohesive. It's minimalist, if you want, in that sense. Is it cosmopolitan? Well, in the sense of professing to be relevant to all mankind, yes. Some would say that you should be forced into doing it, so there might be a kind of negative universalism, but there's a kind of a community with ambitious goals, is how one might summarize it. But in the sense, cosmopolitan sense of toleration of pluralism, not so sure this is a good record. Yes, in many ways. But what do we see now? Kind of intolerance in many cases of the pluralism and the difference. So the question remains open. So to quote these guys, maybe we should join the terms together. Communitarian cosmopolitanism. And like all conjoined terms, it's not a good idea. I'm sure that both sides of it, one can talk about both sides of it, and to put them together, it may not be the reconciliation of them, but there's something to it. it would be more communitarian cosmopolitanism than cosmopolitan communitarianism. Okay, I hope I didn't lose you there. And so at the very end, if you have to summarize it, I would say the imaginary of the Umma is occurring, but what we have is a thin Umma rather than a thick Umma.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. I think I'm really there's so many questions and so many interesting points that you've made. It's a comprehensive in many ways, but very insightful too. You bring a lot of historical basis for this discussion. I would start the discussion by perhaps providing some quick comment / question. You know, as social scientists, we always do. There's the normative and there's the empirical.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think normatively, you've highlighted all the key tensions that exist. You know, the institutionalization of this notion of Umma. It has always run into problems since 1924. And it will continue to, despite the fact that the history of Islam is full of examples of how diversity has been regulated. You know, you mentioned a few examples, but we can also mention the millet system during the Ottoman.
Yes, that's good.
Yeah, you can mention the Dastur al-Medina, the first hijrah that Islam knew. You've got Dastur al-Medina, which regulated religious diversity in particular. And of course, cultural diversity too. What I'm interested in terms of this distinction between normative thinking and empirical reality is the idea of a virtual Islam. Transnational networks, in particular through social media now, are so pervasive that the understanding or the conceptualization of Muslim Ummah is no longer necessarily driven by normative institutionalized thinking. It is something that's captured and perhaps even owned by individuals who are more agentic in the way they would like to perceive of their own position vis-a-vis members of the global Ummah. And therefore you find that what is influencing young people, it's no longer the local imam in the local mosque necessarily, but it may well be a figure of spiritual influence who happens to be thousands of miles away from where they are. And therefore identity and even belonging, so to speak, virtual belonging, the borders have been redrawn. And I think in ways that are not really going to be maybe regained, so to speak, because people are envisioning, you know, they see themselves as no longer necessarily members of this political community or territorialized state, but really there's a much more internet-driven sense of community. So it's not just imagine, because imagine means it, but this is actually a virtual community. Interactions, transactions, solidarities, networking, ties, even drawing in terms of value systems. And so I think I'm really interested in where it's going in relation to this virtual Islam.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I didn't emphasize it enough. Absolutely, I agree with everything you say. Clearly, this kind of virtual Islam has been transformative in a way. So not only has it kind of facilitated connectedness, it's kind of transformed is how we view Islam in the process. And so it's all, you know, it's all got to do with the kind of authority. You know, as you say, you know, the old days you would have gone and sat at the corner of a mosque, and you would have sat at the feet of your sheikh. Now you say your sheikh is, who knows where my sheikh is? And I mean, you know, I mean, for example, you know, if you watched, which like I did and half the world did, Al-Awlaqi's sermons, you would join Al-Qaeda. I mean, they were terrific. They were absolutely wonderful. And I mean, the guy was, I mean, you know, where was he? He was sitting in Yemen waiting to be evaporated, in the American phrase now, to be evaporated by an American military hit. But I mean, his sermons, or whatever you want to call them, videos were unbelievably good. Clear, straightforward, speaking to your concerns. I looked at the, yeah, I'll join. Where can I join? And so I think, you know, that sort of thing does occur. But in the process, what I mean is the way you're looking at Islam is also affecting it too. Because, I mean, this guy is not saying to me, go out and pay your zakat. You know, he's saying to me, to be a good Muslim, you have to go out and bring justice to the world. You have to not just sit back and think about justice. You have to do it. Walk the walk. And you know, he spoke with all this kind of American vernacular, kind of slang sort of way. And he said those sort of things. And it was like, yeah, okay, I got it. And so did everybody else get it. So, but it's telling me that Islam is something different, yeah? Or a particular interpretation of Islam. So I thought, right. So I think you're absolutely right. Here's a slight qualification of it. The implication of what you're saying could be, I know you're not saying this, but the implication is the kind of, I take slight exception to the Olivier Watt argument about global Islam. I take slight exception. Okay, so this is a French writer who's, you know, done brilliant work, and this work is brilliant. But he basically, summarizing it, says deterritorialization. Yeah, okay, so yes, but Panina Verbna, no. Yes, of course, you know, your guys are sitting over there in Yemen, and they're not sitting over here in Melbourne. So that sense, it's deterritorialized. But on the other hand, there has to be a kind of a grounding where you are. And so the valorization comes from actually you're living the life here in Melbourne and saying in Melbourne, but really, I think I should not sit back and think about justice, I should do justice. So in other words, you take the message and you apply it to a particular territory. So that's all I mean by it, you know, a kind of a slight variation.
The Umma is actually.
Yeah, on it.
Can we perhaps take 3 questions? Because we've got about 30 minutes for discussion, and then we'll come back to Jim to try to synthesize the answer. So maybe James first, and show of hands for another 2 questions, please. Alfred, and the third one. We'll go for 2, all right. James.
Thanks, Betty. Thanks for your presentation. I like the use of the term kinship because really it is as a social construct. It's often expressed in kinship terms of brotherhood and trying to build cohesiveness as well through a family obligation, common descent spiritually from Abraham, from the Quran even as a text. I just wanted to comment on that. Shahram and I are just about to publish an article on Iran's state ideology and identity. One of the interesting things, this is another comment, is that they talk about Islam and Shiism almost as 2 separate things. Islam is a universal phenomenon. The revolution was Islamic. It's universal and can be understood by non-Muslims even. But Shiism is something else. And they vary on it. But for Iranian, the purpose of Iran is the Velayat-e Faqih. It's the political system. My question is actually about, again, building on this idea of or the importance of the globalized world. And you touched on this a little bit, but I was wondering if you could expand. How much of the construction or the concern for the Ummah is developing out of contact with non-Muslim beliefs and the non-Muslim world, in addition to, of course, different schools of thought?
Yeah, excellent. 2 really interesting points. I don't know, I'd love to hear more about your state ideology stuff, because that's actually something I'm really interested in. You know, you must know, Emmanuel Sivan, you know, is an Israeli scholar of Islam, wrote a piece in Ijmis fairly soon after the revolution, in which he said, is the Iranian revolution a Shiite revolution? And it's really interesting, but he was interested in not sort of like, you know, the revolution or the politics of it. He was interested in the kind of ideological side of it. And this is what he came out with something like what you're saying, that it's kind of 2-tiered. That surprisingly, the thrust of his article was to say, surprisingly, they're more Islamic at times than Shia. And you know, that's important. So it'd be interesting to see how you carry it on in later periods. But here's the question I have for both of you, and what I'm thinking of, prompted by what you said, is I wonder if there's evolving, maybe in the Iranian case, is there evolving a kind of sub-Umma stuff? You know, we all belong to the Ummah, but it's kind of background noise. But really what counts is the sub-Ummah, and the sub-Ummah is the Shiite Ummah. You know, and so we have kind of almost levels of affiliate. You know, it wouldn't, back to your kinship point, it wouldn't be surprising. I mean, it's the sort of thing we do with kinship all the time, right? So, I mean, you know, you belong to the tribe, but really it's the subunit of the tribe. It's the subunit of the tribe that you belong to. So in a way, there should be probably sub-ummas too, but it'd be interesting to see how, in a way, if they articulate it that way. And if they do, then we go back to my difference question. So if you can say that you belong to the sub-ummah of the Shia, while you belong to the ummah of the Muslims, aren't they at some point going to clash?
Well, they are.
And they are.
They are.
And they are. And so how do you resolve that?
Yeah.
So did you want to, on this point?
I wanted to jump in.
Sorry, David, we've got FN first, sorry. Just
I was
FN
an attendant to that point. I just wanted to, because I was reading something the other day about Turkish Islam, which is seen as heavily Sufistic. And before you mentioned that some would see them as outside of the Ummah because Sufism is seen as heretical. And that was, Sufism was extremely influential during the Ottoman period and became the dominant force in Turkey. And even though they're predominantly Sunni, if you take the Janissaries out of it.
Yeah.
So I sort of wondered, would they fall into a similar situation then as the Shia, in the sense that if they're heavily Sufi influenced, would they be also seen, even though they're Sunni, be seen as also sort of in a weird position in relation to the rest of the
it's a good point, and that's exactly the case. And you know, the permeation of the Sufism through the establishment, etc., through the ulama, high ulama, etc. So it was that, it could be, but it's also I wonder if the difference is this kind of self-consciousness, the objectification part. So there it just kind of happens, and there's a kind of happy coexistence.
Yeah. Exactly.
Here, it's deliberately being fostered by the regime from on top, right? They're definitely saying, by the way, I examined, and I mean, absolutely incomprehensible, and if you ever want to read a fascinating but incomprehensible linguistic PhD. There's one that was produced at Oxford on, literally, all because of software, computer programming. The guy looked at something like 3 million words of Khomeini, and how many times did he use the word Umma?
Wow.
Wow.
And what did he mean by it? What did he mean by it? I have to say that after all that, there was no great blinding insights here, but it was sort of what you were saying. It was sort of that there's both, but that again, the Sivan point, that surprisingly the Iranians were pushing a pan-Islamic idea more than they were at times in the Shiite idea. But that might be, again, for the top-down idea, the legitimization. I'm going to be a bigger power if I push Islam rather than pushing Shiism.
Yeah. But then it changed. I mean, in the
then it
immediate
changed.
Iranian revolution, the emphasis was on pan-Islamic. I think 5-6 years later, the discourse has changed and shifted.
And that is again what that's. Thank you for
so
reminding
there's
me.
a temporal element to it.
Yeah, and that's a good point. That's what he did say. That most of the early stuff is Ummah stuff, and then later it becomes more. Though he doesn't abandon it, but it becomes more.
Exactly.
And of course, this all gets wound up with export of the revolution idea. Having said all that, and now I forgot your key question.
It was just about to what extent is the idea of the Ummah built in relation to non-Muslims?
Non-Westerners, non-Muslims. Much. I think people are reacting to it. I was trying to suggest, and if you look at the intellectual journals of the 30s and the 40s, and to a certain extent the 50s. So just take the most obvious one, Al-Manar, which was the one from Egypt, and had great relevance in Indonesia and the Malay world, etc. They were picking up what some of the Orientalists were saying. So I gave you Thomas Arnold, and he gave those famous lectures in London in 1925. and so they were picked up by Manar, etc. So there was some example of it. Now you can say that people are quite clearly doing this. So you take, I mean, this is not a representative thinker, but Khalid Abul Fadl. Khalid Abul Fadl, for example, who wrote The Great Deception, saying that people have hijacked Islam. You know, bad Islam is dominant because it's been hijacked by the bad guys, and that if we only went back to the sources, we would see. But he'll invoke Rawls. He'll invoke Western thinkers, the non-Muslims, and he'll say the nature of a community is that you must have certain rights, etc. And that, by the way, and I'm probably not going to be able to do it, but you probably, you know that the philosophical debate about communitarianism, or the philosophical criticism of communitarianism, is that it underplays individual rights, just as a philosophy. You know, the community over the individual. Rights is not the common good, not rights. So the argument now is, the question is, to what, since the Western literature is so heavily rights-based, are Muslim thinkers responding to that in ways? And there is, the human rights stuff, Hukuk al-Insan stuff. That's there, but do they connect it to the Ummah? I don't think yet. It's a little bit, but not entirely.
All right, Alfred.
So you said that, or if I understand you correctly, you said that the idea of Ummah, or as it's being played out, at least in the 21st century, is more of a communitarian than a cosmopolitan idea. I'm wondering whether, at least in the West, among younger people, second and third generation kids of migrant parents who may have put their ethnicity or their language before their faith, or at least on par with it, and then these kids are trying to develop and find a new identity, whether in fact we don't see necessarily cosmopolitanism, but maybe what Beck would describe as cosmopolitanizing, I think that's what he said, where people are being forced to be cosmopolitan, being forced to look beyond their parents' ethnic whatever, to develop some kind of Ummah sense, if for no other reason than because governments and policymakers and whatever that are trying to discourage this are actually encouraging it.
It's a really interesting point, and I like it. And I think we'll talk, but I think your work is probably going to be quite relevant to that. I mean, one of the things that I have understudied, one of the things I've underplayed, is the role of minorities, Muslim minorities, or Islam in the minority. I've underplayed it. I just kind of indicated quickly there that I do think it's really important, but I thought it was more important for the challenge that it posed majority Muslim thinkers. Yeah. So majority Muslim thinkers have a kind of ingrained idea of what the Ummah is, right? So I mean, the Ummah, it's not, of course, theologically, doctrinally justified, but you're kind of thinking of Cairo, and you're kind of thinking of Damascus, right? You're thinking of the Middle East. Maybe thinking of Indonesia, Malaysia, maybe. And, so you've kind of got an idea of where Muslims should be. And then, oh my God, they're not. So that was what I was thinking, that caused a challenge to majority thinkers who then had to accept that Muslims in the minority in Australia, Europe, etc., were permanently going to be somewhere else. But your point is that what happens to these minorities when they're living in those societies? And I think you're right. So I think again, I'm afraid two things, not exactly the same, and perhaps contradictory. That one, your point, that the living in the society pushes you to be more open. I'll speak frank, just bluntly. It causes you to be more open, more pluralistic, more tolerant of pluralism. It's just you have to live the life here. So, and I think that's a really, really good point. I'd go with it. But you also said, I thought, that there is a kind of a manipulation of that, or people are being told that they should do it, people are being forced to do it. In other words, we must stop the recruitment to ISIS, we must get involved in the schools, we must do this, we must do that, to the extent that there is a state manipulation of Muslim sentiment, then you have the potential for backfiring. Then you have the potential for the enhancement of a bad communitarianism, pulling together. The wagons, our circle is brought in, rather than I'm now open to everything. So I mean, I'm not saying, I'm not dismissing it. I'm just simply saying that there are costs. So I think you got, you know, but it's interesting to see it play out.
Ben, Andrea.
Thanks, Jim. As always, very insightful and thorough and deeply scholarly work. I'm just a couple of things, but one initially is it necessary to say it's a thin Umma rather than a thick Umma?
Yeah, probably not.
Or could it be that in some places and times it's thick and thin at the same time, in the same neighbourhood, perhaps even in the same family? Because it doesn't have to be one or the other. For some individuals in some circumstances, they may deeply, like the mother of your colleague, they may deeply feel this thick sense of Umma and may engage with all of these principles you've outlined. But their children, or their grandparents, or their neighbour, or their, you know, someone in a rival state or whatever, may feel it only in the very thin sense by what.
Yeah, really helpful qualification. Do I need it? No, that's a good point. No. And in fact, you trigger another thought in my mind. I guess what I was trying to do was reach for the kind of the overview.
Yes.
One must never do these sort of things.
Sorry, always right down.
I know. It's all so complex. I should have left it at that. It's all so complex. There is no clear answer. So yeah, I'm putting a greater clarity on it than perhaps I should. But what you do trigger in my mind is, I wonder then if the sense of Umma is conditional upon circumstances, issues.
Situational.
Situational.
Contextual.
It's situational, it's contextual. So in other words, you know, Faisal, to take an obvious example, you know, King Faisal, Saudi Arabia, was a believing Muslim. He believed in, you know, obviously he was pushing it, but he was pushing it because of a political reason, to counter Nasser and Arab nationalism. So we have all that side, right? But then we get to 1967, and the third holiest city of Islam is gone. And you want me to play anymore with you guys in the West? I'm going to put the oil embargo on. You've really hit a core issue now for me. So, I mean, so what might have been kind of thin Umma becomes thick Umma when Jerusalem goes. And presumably in many other cases, those sort of things. So yeah. So
I wonder if in the same day, the same person can't be tweeting something that suggests they're very much involved in a thick Umma.
Yeah.
But when they go to their local mosque, and they don't really like the people at their local mosque, so they don't really feel that much of an attachment to them. And in that context, they feel it's a very thin Umma. But then they go home and, you know, they're engaged in some chat forum or whatever where they. Anyway, sorry. So
it's the parallel to ethnicity. I feel more Kurdish when the Turks are bombing me.
Right.
But we all, of course, have the, in my view, very informative example of the Rohingyas in Myanmar.
Yeah.
I can tell you that a lot of people in North Africa would never even discuss Burma or Myanmar. But because of the plight of the Muslim minority now, all of a sudden what we would call thick Umma is triggered, and there's so much stuff about that, collecting money, trying to pressure government to do things. So I think in my view, one of the key triggers for this notion of global Muslim Ummah is a sense of injustice being you know, inflicted upon brothers of the Muslim faith. In most cases, people don't actually think about it like that. It's that we are all believers, and that's it.
Yeah, exactly.
They don't need to have a formalized network But when it happens that there is a case of systematic, for instance, abuse against Muslim minorities, like we had in Myanmar, then of course it becomes very much, people are aware of Myanmar, they're aware of the Muslim minority there, they want to do things to bring about it. So I think that's probably what you are wanting to imply, that contextual circumstances mean that sometimes people are able to negotiate both on a daily basis.
Yeah, really good.
Yeah.
It's a good qualification. Yeah, I take it on board. I don't need to...
We have a question from Andrea.
James, I'm not in this field at all, so this is left to field. But I wanted to bring where Fetty started and where Irfan went. And back to, is it Werbner or Verbner? Verbner, the German spelling. Yeah. I'm interested in the notion of virtual Islam. And this question, in your answer to Fetty, you started talking about the deterritorializing and the territorializing. So Verbner's importance of place and embodiment versus the digital as a deterritorialized space, right? Then we had Irfan talking about how third, fourth generation young people might kind of in a tension between needing to be more cosmopolitan because they're out of place in a sense, but also finding place in this virtual deterritorialized world, right? So I'm kind of thinking, would it be helpful to you to think about the virtual space not as a no place, but as a place, and moreover a place of belonging?
Yeah.
Where there is embodiment, there is affect, as you were saying in terms of the speeches of, sorry, whatever his name was, Al-Qaeda. I said I wasn't in the series, so I don't know the names.
That's great.
But I am thinking, you know, bringing a more kind of media lens on it. Could you think about the digital space as a place, not as a no place, not as deterritorializing, but as a place-making space?
Yes.
Where people do have embodied relationships and affective relationships to one another, and so it could be a space of building thick Umma, even though it's virtual.
Wow, you guys are great. I'm going to take you back.
That's left to field.
No, you got, yeah. My God, I'm going to get out, change my whole book now. We're connecting. That's great. Absolutely.
Going back to the abstract.
Yeah, great. I like that. And I like I also like your kind of out of place, finding place.
Yeah.
That's kind of nice.
Discussions. Geographers talk about no place.
I have been scrambling. I mean, Olivia is a friend of mine, but I'm just trying to. I'm determined to find a difference. I'm determined to say he's wrong.
You have to be tolerant of that.
I'm intolerant. So thank you. You give me more ammunition. I want to sort of qualify him and kind of be nice about it, but.
To think about the virtual as not embodied, not material, and in fact, it's increasingly becoming a material.
Yeah, I think this is right. I mean, and again, he probably doesn't mean it this way, but I mean, I think, you know, it's that kind of, as you know very, very well, this whole globalization literature stuff. You know, it's like everything's floating. Well, everything's not floating, and you know the kind of, and then, but it's not, but it's a little bit more too than the globalization localization kind of debate too. It's that there's got to be, as you say, there's got to be a kind of a placement. Somewhere, but the placement can be virtual or digital, and I think that's really nice that you it's the anchoring, to reword hers, the embodiment, but it doesn't negate the global logic.
No.
So and I think that that does fit nicely with Irfan's idea too. So. Oh, excellent! Oh my goodness!
Well, I think on that very, very hopeful, optimistic notion, I think we're very much on time now to bring this seminar to a close, and I think you will agree that it's been fascinating. It's been really.
Well, I thank you for listening. I mean, it is very much a work in progress.
Absolutely.
And I mean, I haven't written a word of it. So
it's all coming.
It's you know, sort of it's evolving. And this discussion has really helped to push it along. So I thank you.
No, thank you. I think the good news is James is still with us. Jim with us in Australia, so to speak, till the end of the year. So we are more or less certain to host him again. I hope.
Yeah, you've got to write my next chapter for me.
Before the conference. So please join me in thanking Jim for a fantastic.